The rotting wooden gate of Beckett Homestead appeared in the morning mist like a cut straight into the heart of the past. Thomas Beckett pulled his leather jacket tight, his hand gently gripping the reins as the old horse cleared its throat and slowed. Before the gate, not a sign of a peaceful beginning, were 5 swaying figures, hanging like curses in flesh. Thomas paused, his heart pounding like a drum. On the gate were 5 women, long hair tangled, dresses torn, bare feet not touching the ground, ropes around their necks, but their bodies still moved. He squinted. Yes, the morning breeze wasn't the only thing making their dresses sway. He dismounted, the mud clinging to his boots as if to hold him back. Slowly, step by step, he reached out and touched the first woman's wrist. Cold. But then, faint as the echo of an undying soul, a pulse vibrated beneath his fingers. Thomas whispered, "They're alive." Without thinking, he pulled out his knife and cut the first rope. The bodies fell, and he caught them. Their breaths were shallow, their necks were bruised. One by one, he cut the ropes, catching 5 bodies, all of them gasping for breath. He was no longer a soldier, no longer holding a gun and chasing Indians across the desert. But today, he was saving people he had once labeled enemies. In the dilapidated cabin, where dust covered the wooden altar and the smell of dampness mixed with old ash, Thomas laid each person down on the floor, near the cold stone fireplace. He lit a fire, the first fire he had lit since leaving the army. The first to open her eyes was a girl with messy black hair, eyes like smoldering coals. Her voice was hoarse and choked. "You shouldn't have cut that rope." Thomas looked into her eyes. There was no fear, only warning, and something deeper, a tug of gratitude and unspoken pain. "But I did," he replied, softly but firmly. The fire crackled in the hearth as if in agreement. Outside, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the crooked cactus on the porch. Thomas Beckett had no idea what lay ahead. But the only thing he knew for sure was that the act of cutting that rope had bound him to something greater than any legacy. The rotting wooden gate of Beckett Homestead appears in the morning mist like a cut straight into the heart of the past. Thomas Beckett pulled his leather jacket tight, his hand gently gripping the reins as the old horse cleared its throat and slowed. Before the gate, not a sign of a peaceful beginning, were 5 swaying figures, hanging like curses in flesh. Thomas paused, his heart pounding like a drum. On the gate were 5 women, long hair tangled, dresses torn, bare feet not touching the ground, ropes around their necks, but their bodies still moved. He squinted. Yes, the morning breeze wasn't the only thing making their dresses sway. He dismounted, the mud clinging to his boots as if to hold him back. Slowly, step by step, he reached out and touched the first woman's wrist, cold. But then, faint as the echo of an undying soul, a pulse vibrated beneath his fingers. Thomas whispered, "They're alive." Without thinking, he pulled out his knife and cut the first rope. The bodies fell, and he caught them. Their breaths were shallow, their necks were bruised. One by one, he cut the ropes, caught 5 bodies, all of them gasping for breath. He was no longer a soldier, no longer holding a gun and chasing Indians across the desert. But today, he was saving people he had once labeled enemies. In the dilapidated cabin, where dust covered the wooden altar and the smell of dampness mixed with old ash, Thomas laid each person down on the floor, near the cold stone fireplace. He lit a fire, the first fire he had lit since leaving the army. The first to open her eyes was a girl with messy black hair, eyes like smoldering coals. Her voice was hoarse and choked. "You shouldn't have cut that rope." Thomas looked into her eyes. There was no fear, only warning, and something deeper, a tug of gratitude and unspoken pain. "But I did," he replied, softly but firmly. The fire crackled in the hearth as if in agreement. Outside, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the crooked cactus on the porch. Thomas Beckett had no idea what lay ahead. But the only thing he knew for sure was that the act of cutting that rope had bound him to something greater than any legacy. Dawn had not yet broken, but Thomas Beckett had long since risen. He sat on the porch of the cabin, a cup of strong black coffee in his hand, his eyes scanning the misty trail ahead. The air was artificially quiet, like the silence before a hailstorm. The faint sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Steady, slow, confident. Thomas stood, his hand instinctively resting on the Winchester propped against the door. In the thinning mist, 3 figures on horseback emerged, led by a man in a long black coat, as straight as a rusty sword. Ahioka stepped onto the porch, her face pale but her eyes still burning. "Here he comes," she said softly. The man on the horse stopped at the top of the hill, looking down at the cabin. No introduction was needed. Thomas knew at once. This was Judge Silas Morrison. The way he sat upright, his face uncovered, as if the land was his and the survival of anyone else was wrong. Morrison's hand rested lightly on the pistol at his hip, a gesture that was not threatening, but rather a declaration. He said nothing. He just watched long, slow, then jerked the reins. The 3 horses turned and headed into the woods, disappearing as if they had never been there. Tiva appeared behind the door, her face red with anger. "What does he want?" "Not to talk," Thomas said. "Definitely." Nasha, still silent, stepped out, placing something on the porch floor, an old leather bag. Thomas saw the edge of a map, a red wax seal, and what looked like a contract. "We got the papers," Ahioka explained. "Every piece of land he took, every forged signature, every seal he bought." Thomas nodded slightly. He knew it wasn't just about protecting 5 women, it was about securing something that could destroy a false kingdom. At noon, the group sat in the cabin, plotting their plans. Thomas took out the map, drawing a circle around the vulnerable area. Tiva asked to keep the colt. Nita asked to learn how to use a knife. Izzy made soup, listening and nodding to each suggestion. "We don't retreat," Ahioka said. "If we must die, at least here, where my fathers lived." Thomas sat silently. He had seen enough battles, Indians, armies, highwaymen, but he had never seen anyone like Ahioka. She had no army, no weapons, but her eyes held something that even Morrison would have feared, the determination to live right. As the afternoon wore on, a small package was hung on the door of the cabin. Someone had left it quietly. Thomas opened it. Inside was a piece of paper, scribbled, "I'll be back tonight. If they live, they all die." Beside it was a wolf's tooth, soaked in blood. Thomas clenched his fists, his knuckles cracking. He looked around the old cabin, the strong women, the dirty papers. All of it was in his hands now, not by choice, by duty. Ahioka stepped out, her eyes on the hilltop where Morrison had stood. She said softly, "You know he won't stop." Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the darkness creeping down the mountain. "And neither will we." The afternoon sun reddened the valley as if the sky itself knew that blood was coming. Thomas Beckett replaced the planks in the cabin window frame, his hands covered in wood dust and thorns. No longer an inherited home, now a fortress. A small base in the middle of the desert, where there were only 2 options, stand or perish. While Thomas reinforced the porch, inside the cabin, Ahioka carefully checked the cartridges in her Colt. She sat cross-legged on the floor, as if preparing for a ritual. Each bullet was cleaned, each pin pressed gently with calloused fingertips. It was no longer a weapon, it was life in a world that had forgotten justice. Tiva, hot-tempered but tough, practiced loading the rifle with astonishing speed. As she did so, she muttered an ancient curse in Hopi, as if sending a cold-blooded greeting to the oncoming attackers. Nita, her hand shaking as she picked up the first knife. Isi stood beside him, guiding his every move. Armrests, wrists, lowering his center of gravity. "This isn't about killing," she said softly. "This is about surviving." Nasha held no weapon. She sorted through papers, fingerprints, documents Morrison had used to stifle the Apache community. She knew. A bullet could kill, but the truth could bury the system. Thomas stepped in, dusting off his coat. "We have a few hours before dark." "Are there mines?" Tiva asked. "Number. But we have oil, broken glass, and rope." Ahioka nodded. "That's enough." They took turns guarding. They set traps at the back door, cut cactus branches to make spikes. Issy lit a pot of resin. If the Morrisons got through the front door, they wouldn't survive the smoke and fire. "You've done this before?" Thomas asked Ahioka as they tied rope around the window. "We've been fighting since we could walk," she replied. "This isn't the first time, but it may be the last." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of ropes being pulled and nails being hammered. Before the sun had set, Ahioka used burning charcoal to draw a white circle on the ground in front of the cabin boundary. The Apache believe that the souls of the dead cannot cross this line, she said. Tonight, whoever enters lives or stays forever. Thomas looked down at the charcoal outline, then into her eyes. No words were needed. He understood. Tiva climbed onto the roof of the cabin, her Colt at her side, her eyes on the forest. Nita sat near the door, her knife clutched, the wind blowing her hair. Issy lit torches, placing them around her like sentinel fires. Nasha, her hands on her files, whispered only one sentence in the darkness. Don't let him burn again. Night fell like a knife drawn from its sheath. The wind changed direction, and from afar, the sound of horses' hooves began to ring, heavy, steady, and bloody. Thomas tightened his grip on the Winchester, standing in front of the cabin door. Ahioka, beside him, whispered, "Ready, landowner?" Thomas's lips curled, not quite a smile, but not quite fear. "I'm not holding land today," he said. "I'm holding people." The first shot rang out like a thunderclap tearing through the night. Bullets hit the wooden posts in front of the cabin, splintering planks flying everywhere. Thomas Beckett wrenched the door open, whirled inside, and shouted, "Here they come." No orders were needed. Everyone was in position. Tiva on the roof fired first. The bullet cut through the air, straight into the chest of the horseman who was preparing to fire the firecracker. He fell like a sandbag. The horse neighed and ran away. Ruby, Tiva, screamed a curse in Hopi, her eyes blazing. Ahioka slid across the cabin floor like a ghost. Her position was the left window, where she saw two others crawling through the brush. She didn't fire. She waited. And when one of them poked his head through the door, boom, the bullet from her Colt went straight into his forehead. On the floor, Nita trembled, her hand holding the knife Issy had given her. She didn't know what to do, only that backing down meant death. And at that moment, someone kicked open the back door. Before he could even cross the threshold, the fire trap went off. Izzy threw the boiling plastic pot from inside. He screamed in agony, writhing like a living torch. Thomas, in the middle of the cabin, cocked his gun and shouted to Nasha, "Back to the papers." Nasha hugged the leather bag, crawled close to the ground, avoiding the random bullets from outside. She didn't fight with a gun, but her presence was a pillar. If the papers were lost, all the sacrifices would be in vain. A roar rose from the other side of the fence. Silas Morrison rode out on horseback, holding his silver gun high. "Thomas Beckett, hand them over. That cabin isn't yours. Cut the rope and you'll sign your death warrant." Thomas stepped onto the porch. Bullets were still flying behind him, the Winchester in his hand. The wind blew his coat, revealing blood on his shoulder. He was wounded, but his eyes were as cold as wrought iron. "This cabin was my uncle's," he said. "It's mine now. If you want it, over my dead body first." Morrison pulled the trigger. The bullet whizzed past Thomas's head, shattering the wooden post. Without further ado, they charged. A flood of horsemen, guns, fire, and screams swept into the cabin like a black sea. Tiva shot two from the roof. Ahioka cut down the third with a knife as he climbed in through the window. Thomas, wounded, still held the main door. Issy used a tripwire to knock one down and smashed his head with a log. Nita, for the first time in her life, stabbed the man who was strangling Grace with her knife. Blood spurted. The man staggered. Nita screamed, not in triumph, but in horror. Nasha crawled up to the attic, clutching the file. From there she had a clear view of the burning cabin, the smoke, the flames licking the roof, but the hearts of the people inside were still not broken. The last of Morrison's men made it onto the porch, knife in hand. But Ahioka was waiting. She spun the Colt, hitting him in the knee. He fell. "This is our land," she whispered. "You have no right." When the smoke settled, the fire died down, and the gunfire faded. Morrison stood alone amid the corpses and dead horses. Blood spattered his coat, his gun still clutched. He looked at the cabin, now a breathing fortress, and shouted, "You think you've won?" A woman's voice rang out behind him, hoarse, but clear. "I'm alive, Silas. And I told them everything." Morrison spun, His eyes widened. Before him was Margaret, his ex-wife, the one he declared dead, and the one he feared most. A cold wind whistled through the space between Morrison and the woman he believed was gone forever. Margaret stood there, her cloak dusted with red desert dust, her long Apache braid swaying against her shoulders. Her face was suntanned and hard as rock, but her eyes, the eyes made Morrison take a step back. "Why?" Morrison exclaimed, the gun shaking slightly in his hand. "You're dead. I saw your body." Margaret didn't move. Her voice was low, even, like the beat of an ancient ritual drum. "You saw nothing. Only what you wanted. I hid. I lived. And now I'm back. To finish what you started with blood." Thomas Becket, his hands still bloody, stepped out of the cabin. Between him and Margaret stood Morrison, no longer the judge, but the man afraid of the truth. Nasha stepped down from the cabin's attic, the file she had protected intact. She handed it to Margaret, who had been preparing for this moment for years. "Here are copies of the fake land contract, my fake death certificate, and the inventory of assets you recovered from the women you captured," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Each one is signed by you or someone under your command." Morrison laughed harshly, but no one laughed along. There was no gang, no more gunfire, just the eyes of the survivors on him, and accusatory silence. "They are savages," he growled. "They have no right to accuse anyone." Thomas clenched his fists. "They are not accusers. They are evidence. And now they have witnesses." Tiva aimed her gun from the roof of the cabin, Ahyoka standing silently beside Thomas. Isi put her hand on Nita's trembling shoulder, whispering, "You are seeing justice." Margaret stepped forward, only a few steps from Morrison. "I was a believer. I thought love could change people. I was wrong. Now I'm going to tell the truth to anyone who will listen to the federal court." Morrison roared like a cornered animal. He raised his gun pointed at Margaret. Time seemed to freeze. Thomas lunged forward, pushing Margaret aside. Morrison pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed Thomas's shoulder, but the Winchester in his hand was already aimed. Bang! Morrison collapsed, blood spurting from his right shoulder, the gun flying from his hand. He screamed, clutching the wound, his teeth grinding. Thomas stepped forward, pressing the barrel to his forehead. But he didn't pull the trigger. "We don't hang people like you," he said. "We bring them out." The sound of hooves echoed, but not gangs this time. Horses in silver saddles. Men of the law. From across the hill, Marshal Thompson appeared, bearded white, badges gleaming. He took in the scene. Morrison bleeding on the ground, Margaret standing upright, and the cabin scorched but still standing. "We're late," Thomas said. Marshall dismounted, nodding slowly. But not too late. He looked at Margaret, taking the papers from her. "This is what we've waited 10 years for." Morrison was tied up, screaming in vain. Tiva dropped her gun. Ahyoka bowed her head. Nita sobbed. And Nasha, for the first time, smiled. The next morning, the first light of the sun crested the Santa Catalina Mountains and crept into the San Pedro Valley, illuminating the dazed face of Silas Morrison. He was tied to his own black horse, his head bowed, his shoulders still bandaged with an old bandage. Thomas's bullet wounds still oozed blood. The Becket cabin was no longer a battlefield. It was a makeshift courthouse. Marshal Thompson had built a makeshift table out of the broken wooden door and spread it over the files and papers that Nasha, Margaret, and Violet had collected. They worked in silence, each sheet unrolled, each ink mark examined under a magnifying glass. Margaret sat up straight before Marshall, her voice steady and decisive like a lawyer in court. "He forged a debt note, bought ancestral land by force, burned houses, arrested people, and staged my death to seize my ex-husband's family fortune." Marshall nodded, saying nothing. He had read it all the night before. What made him silent, not out of surprise, but out of the silent shame of his profession? Nasha followed up with action. She placed it on the table, Tiva's land contract, handwritten debt note, no official seal, detailed map of the old gold mine, now under the name of a phantom company under Morrison's name, a copy of Margaret's death certificate. Morrison sneered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "You think that piece of trash will defeat me? I am the law in this town." Marshall turned, his eyes as steely as knives. "Not anymore." Thomas leaned against the door, bandages wrapped around his shoulders, eyes fixed on Morrison. He didn't say a word, but his presence was an irrevocable declaration. He had chosen sides. Tiva, holding a cleaned Colt, said, "If you don't stop him, we'll do it again." Every time, Izzy, the mother of the group, gently placed her hand on the table. "I taught your town's girls to read. I trusted you, but I was wrong. Now I want my kids to be free and not afraid of a man in a black coat." Morrison gasped, then burst into hysterical laughter. "You don't know how many judges I've bought. I've survived 5 terms. They need me to keep order." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes scornful. "Your order is the hangman's collar around our daughter's neck." She pulled a bloody piece of cloth from her pocket, the same strip she'd bitten off when she was tied up. "This isn't evidence, it's a memory, and I'll tell it anywhere, to anyone who needs to know." Marshall raised his hand. "That's enough. He'll be taken back to Tucson. The federal commissioner will look at the file." Morrison struggled, but no one paid any attention. Thomas left the cabin, standing in the sun. His eyes turned east to where Morrison's horses would take him. Inside the cabin, Nita was baking the first cake with the ashes from the battle. Isi recited an old Apache prayer. Nasha wrote a letter to the federal court. Margaret whispered to Tiva about the lands no one had dared to reclaim. And Ahioka, the quietest, put her hand on the cabin door, her eyes on Thomas from behind. "We don't have to kill him," she said. "We just have to keep him from continuing." Thomas nodded, not turning around. "Justice isn't hanging people. It's keeping them alive to face what they've done." When the sun rose, the horses rode away, Morrison tied up, head bowed, eyes angry, but no one was afraid anymore. The nightmare had a name. And now, a record. 3 days after Morrison was taken away, it rained, the first rain in 2 months of dry weather. Heavy drops fell on the scorched roof of the cabin, mixing with the smell of earth, old smoke, and spilled blood. It was not just rain, it was washing away. Thomas Beckett sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his left hand, his right hand still bandaged. The wound had not healed, but the ache now felt more like a reminder than a threat. Ahioka sat a few feet away from him, her dark hair loose, drying in the wind. She was sewing Izzy's shirt back together with needle and thread, each stitch steady and even. No one spoke, but the silence was not heavy. It was the silence of survivors, not needing to speak, just knowing that each other was alive. Nita planted seeds at the foot of the old fence. The ground had been turned over. With each turn, she took a deep breath, as if the smell of damp mud was proof that she was back on the ground. Tiva trained a new pony from an abandoned stable. She named it Ash, Ash because it survived the fire, just like her and the house. Isi rearranged the kitchen, muttering, "The fire may burn, but the stove is the soul of the house." She used old cabin boards to build shelves and repaired every crumbling corner by hand. Nasha sat upstairs, fountain pen in hand, writing letters to the state court, the newspapers, and the Native Women's Association. They need to know the truth, not for revenge, but to believe that this can be over. Margaret stayed at least until she heard from the court. She and Thomas sometimes sat together in the evenings, sharing a glass of corn wine. "I thought I was dead," she said. "But then I realized proving the truth is not dead." One afternoon, Ahioka handed Thomas a strip of white cloth. "Tie it to the gate," she said. "In my culture, it's an invitation for the good spirit to return." Thomas tied the strip to the old wooden post, the one that had been plowed by bullets, now a symbol of beginning. He was no longer a keeper of the land. He was a promise keeper. That afternoon, Margaret received the letter, a red federal seal. She read it aloud. "Morrison is indicted on 8 counts. He is being held without bail. Trial will be held in 2 weeks." No cheers. No tears. Just a nod. Thomas asked softly, "What now?" Ahioka replied, "Now I live, as my ancestors lived." Nita finished sowing the last seed. Tiva saddled Ash. Isi boiled water. Nasha wrote another letter, this time to herself 10 years from now, and the cabin now home. Every day after the rain, the valley changed color. The cracked earth became soft and moist. The red dusty path was now interspersed with the first green shoots of grass. The birds that had been silent during the gunfight began to return, chirping on the broken fence. Thomas rebuilt the gate with his left hand, his right still aching, but not bothered. Each board was nailed with a new nail, not to keep out the enemy this time, but to welcome life. The name Beckett Farm was replaced. On the old wooden crossbar, Tiva used her knife to carve a new word: Apache, land of rebirth, a combination of Apache and, meaning a place of peace. Ahioka had suggested the name. No one is bought, sold, or hanged here anymore, she said. We live for each other, not for the memory of fear. Nasha built a small room next to the cabin to store the papers. She called it the House of Truth. Copies of Morrison's papers, court confirmations, and records of missing women were taped to the walls. Whoever comes here, she said, will know why we fight. EC opened a community kitchen. Every afternoon, she cooked a large pot and set it in front of the house. If anyone is hungry, they eat. No one asks for their background. The first Native American child to stop by was a Yaqui girl, big-eyed and dusty. She didn't ask her name, just ladled her a big bowl of porridge and added a crunchy corn tortilla. Nita held a reading and writing class under the oak tree in front of the house. A Mexican boy, a former cattle rustler, sat practicing his letters. She was patient, her voice softer than before, because she knew now, knowledge is what keeps you upright. Tiva trained young women in the neighborhood to ride horses and shoot. Not to kill, she said, but so that no one would dare to look down on them. Clarabelle, her hair still streaked with rope, began to smile again. She and Thomas built 3 more small houses behind the cabin, for those who need shelter. Margaret contributed the wood, and Nasha drew up the plans. We're not building a fort, she said. We're building a future. Thomas, who had intended to live alone, never ate dinner alone. Every night, by the light of an oil lamp, the 6 of them sat around the table, sharing food, stories of the day, and dreams. One day, Thomas asked, "What if we wrote a letter inviting others to come here?" Clarabelle replied, "As long as they respect the blood that was shed for this land, the door is always open." News of the rebirth land began to spread. A wife fled the violence, an old man driven out of town, an Apache veteran with a missing leg. Each person came, bringing their story and their skills, and they stayed. A new little world is forming, in the desert, in the ashes, in the wounds, with kindness, freedom, and resilience. By the following spring, the Apachuan land had tripled in size. From an old cabin, there were now 5 houses, a communal garden, a deep well, and a small school. People kept coming: runaway women, workers, farmers who had lost their land, deserters who didn't want to kill more. They didn't ask permission, they just asked for opportunity. Thomas and the women didn't call it property, they called it community shelter. And that's what started to catch people's attention. One day in April, a fancy carriage stopped at the gate. The door opened, and out stepped Mr. Burton Hale, the land commissioner from the capital city of Phoenix. White shirt, tie, black felt hat, eyes that measured every inch of land in dollars. Thomas shook his hand. Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I was just dropping by. I heard you turned the cabin into a relief camp." "Nobody saved," Thomas replied. "They stood up for themselves. I just didn't chase them away." Hale walked around, looking at the classroom, the vegetable garden, the Apache kids laughing near the well. "The thing is, this land is still under the state's old mine rehabilitation program," he said with a chuckle. "That means it's state property." Nasha stepped forward, holding up a copy of Jeremiah Beckett's bequest. "It's legal. The federal court stamped it." Hale frowned at the papers. "That's right. But the work that followed, especially the settlement, was not registered under Arizona zoning law. Plus, many of the people here don't have papers." Clarabelle stepped forward. "So you can't live without papers?" Hale chuckled. "That's not true. But if you want to be protected by the law, you have to obey it. Otherwise, you're just squatting." At that moment, a man stepped out from behind Hale's car. Jasper Quinn, Morrison's former deputy. Thomas clenched his fists. "We're rebuilding," Thomas said. "We're not destroying anything. We're supplying our own water, growing our own vegetables, educating our children. Is there a law against that?" Hale smiled. "Number. But there is a law that requires state approval of communal land. And I'm afraid this community has never applied." Nasha was silent. No one taught us that. That's not my job, Hale said. I just follow the rules. But I can make a suggestion. If this community agrees to annex to the Arizona Frontier Mining Company, I can make sure everything is legalized. The land is registered. In return, you let the company build a control station here. There was silence. Then Clarabelle spoke up, not loudly, but clearly. So legal is selling cheap? And keeping freedom is illegal? Tiva sneered. Your laws are like ropes. Thomas stepped forward. We'll file. Ourselves, our lawyers, our papers. You don't have to come back. Hale nodded slowly. Just so you know, the state doesn't like this model. He got into the car. The door closed. The wheels rolled away, leaving dust and wind whistling. Icy said, "It won't let up." Nasha looked at Thomas. "We have to learn the law." "Really?" Thomas nodded. "If bullets don't kill us, papers will." Arizona Federal Courthouse, Tucson. That June, so hot that the ink on the paper seemed to melt. But inside the courtroom, no one felt the heat. All eyes were on the left row, where Clarabelle, Thomas, Nasha, and the legal representative of Rebirth Land Saturday. On the right, Burton Hale and the representative of the mining company. His face was still stone, but his collar was slightly beaded with sweat. In front of him was the federal judge, a silver-haired black man, a former Marine, who had been chased out of town for helping a Mexican escape a wrongful conviction. He looked at Thomas, then at Clarabelle. His eyes were not suspicious, just waiting to see how they would stand. Nasha stood first. She held up the evidence: inheritance papers, verification records, maps of the current situation, the application for recognition of the autonomous community. "We are not asking for special privileges," she said. "We are on record that a group of people who were hanged, who were driven from their land, have the right to live, to farm, and to defend themselves." Clarabelle continued, "We have no statues. We have no banks. But we have our own laws. That is, whoever comes is protected. Whoever sows reaps. No one is property." Hale chuckled, then stood up, his voice steady. "Your Honor, this is not a moral issue. This is the law of the land. They don't register. They build houses, they open schools, they open farms without permits. They call it freedom. We call it lawlessness." Clarabelle looked at him, her eyes like knives. "There are laws that are not written, but we live and die by them." Thomas, finally, stood up. He had not brought a speech. Just say, "I used to hold a gun for this government. But I have never seen the government that protects women hung like flags in front of my house. Now I do not ask permission to live well. I declare to live well, as a right." The judge was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "The law does not exist to serve the powerful. It is to control power. Who lives there? Did you really create the place, or did you just take advantage of it?" He flipped through the files. "I see. 37 adults, 12 children, 5 writing camps, a classroom, a community kitchen, and no violent deaths in the last 9 months." He looked up. "I call that a community." The gavel came down. The court confirmed, Rebirth Land, Apache Women, is recognized as a legal autonomous community under Arizona law, governed by civilian representatives, not by any corporation. Clarabelle burst into tears. Nasha embraced her. Isi, standing behind her, put her hand on her heart. Tiva nodded as if to say, "Yes." Hale said nothing. He left the room silently. August of the same year, Thomas Beckett stood before the wooden gate. In the twilight, the children were playing. Clarabelle carried water into the garden. Nasha continued writing, now for a small newspaper. Isi and Nita taught a group of newcomers to read and write. Tiva rode Ash, now the leading horse of the herd. There was a new sign on the gate, Apache Women, where no one has to hang themselves to live. Thomas touched the old burn mark on the gate, now only a scar. He said softly, "We did not win by bleeding. We won by not giving up." Clarabelle walked over and took his hand. "And for the first time, I believe, we really lived." In a quiet corner of Arizona, where dust once carried the echoes of gunfire and the weight of injustice, something unexpected took root, not just a place, but a way of life. Apache Women, born from ash and defiance, became more than a shelter. It became a symbol that even in a land scarred by cruelty, dignity can be rebuilt with bare hands and honest hearts. This story isn't just about one rancher and 5 brave Apache women. It's about reclaiming voice when the world has silenced you. It reminds us that freedom isn't granted by papers or officials, it's earned, each day, by standing up for those who've been told they don't belong. If you've ever felt powerless, invisible, or out of place in your own country, you understand. Justice isn't always loud sometimes. It's as quiet as planting seeds in dry soil and daring to believe they'll grow. For many of us, over 40, we've seen the system fail those who built it. We've witnessed how easily compassion is overlooked in favor of order. But Apachuan teaches that compassion itself is the truest form of order, the kind that doesn't need fences or titles. It speaks to a simple truth we often forget in adulthood. Belonging begins when someone says, "You can stay." And so tonight, as you sit with your own thoughts, maybe by a window or with a cup of something warm, ask yourself, who have you allowed to belong? And who once cut the rope for you when the world turned its back? If this story settled somewhere in your chest like an ember waiting to glow, consider passing that warmth to someone else. A kind word, a shared memory, or perhaps a story of your own. And if you'd like more stories like this one, we'd love to have you around the fire again. Just click like, share it with someone who might need it, and stay close. The West, after all, isn't just a place. Sometimes, it's a second chance.